I would first like to start with an acknowledgement of the country. I am talking to you from the land of the Gadigal people. I acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land, and I pay my respects to elders emerging past and present. And I also want to acknowledge that this is stolen lands, and I am an uninvited settler on these stolen lands. It's very interesting that you picked this because I specifically remember writing this sentence that the Pakistani media are at war. You see, the fact that this has been ongoing, it's not something that happens for a month or for 2 months. It's not something, and when I say something, I mean the narrativization of Afghan refugees as the enemy of the state or as a security threat to the national security of the country, or as a burden, or other ways that they have been framed in a stereotypical manner, contributes to my finding that it is a constant attack on Afghan refugees in Pakistan, specifically the fact that they have been politicized in a way where they are an oppressed community. They are pushed to the margins. And when I say they have been pushed to the margins, that means they are not allowed to participate in activities or have the same kind of access to education, which by international refugee law, and I'm not an expert in international refugee law, but for those who are and may be listening to this will understand that when you accept a group or an individual as a refugee, there are certain rights that they have. But when you start depriving those people of their legitimate rights under the law, that means that you are now oppressing them, you are at war with them. It started specifically in the late 1990s, but more so when these Afghan refugees, and as my research finds, were used as a collateral in Pakistan's alliance or allegiance with the US in their so-called war on terror that, as we all know, started after 2001, after 9/11. So now they have been dragged in someone else's war. They have been dragged in someone else's politics, and that's why I argue that the Pakistani media is at war with the Afghan refugees. I looked at 3 years of coverage, and in that coverage, one of the biggest or most prominent ways that the Afghan refugees were portrayed in the media, in the coverage, whether it's long form current affair coverage or whether it's daily news reporting, was dehumanization. Now, what dehumanization means is that in a literal sense, you dehumanize, you take the human out, which means that you are either treating them as objects or you're treating them as a community that does not have personhood. To take that human aspect from an individual means that you are invalidating that they are a person. Now, what happens is that by dehumanizing, which means that you are now not considering them or portraying them as a human who has challenges, who is affected by the war, who's affected by the politicization of this conflict in a way where they are dragged into becoming a collateral, becoming the damage, is by comparing them to things that are not human, such as a burden. A burden is not a personified thing. It's a burden. It's like a heavy burden or a heavy object. In some cases, and as research also shows, much research has happened where refugees are specifically treated as non-humans. In this way, they're either treated, either referred to as animals as well. For example, the specific terminology of they come as swarms. Now, a swarm is a word that is used for bees. when there are lots of bees, or flocks, which is used for animals. For example, I also talk about these hashtag campaigns that were started on social media, where Afghan refugees were referred to as dogs, not necessarily in the English language, but in the local or national Urdu language. So I'll come back to the question. By dehumanizing means that you are now comparing them as things, as animals, and taking that personhood, that agency away from them. We witnessed, it was witnessed it has been witnessed not only in the coverage of Afghan refugees, but more so in the global coverage of refugees and migrants. In mostly Western media systems, they are referred to as parasites that are considered to be leeching off the system, which again is also another word of burden, or as ants or animals. In the second, after the world wars, there were communities of Jews that were related to as cockroaches or mice, and research has shown. And so, and also in for example, in the Australian media, a lot of narrative and media coverage of refugees is done by calling them boat people. Now they call them boat people because they want to portray refugees as people who come here illegally, which is not always the case in boats. So the most coverage, visual coverage that you will see specifically in Australian media, but also in European media, is showing them as big groups on boats, where you see them as little, black dots, but you don't see them. You don't humanize them. You don't talk to them. Their voice is not heard. We listen to them in some cases, but that listening is done mostly through a white perspective. Somebody is telling their story. They are not given an opportunity to tell their story. And so that is where this theoretical concept of dehumanization comes from. Yeah, that's a very valid question, Ali. The first thing is that we all know, and it's not a hidden fact, that for most of the time, if not all, the Pakistani government is just a puppet government on the face, and the real system is run by the establishment, like in most countries. But more specifically here, we're talking about Pakistan and the involvement of the military establishment. Now, what happens is, and of course, this is my understanding from reading and also working as a journalist. I used to work as a journalist in Pakistan. I've also worked as a journalist in Afghanistan. The thing is that there are certain areas that are a no-go for journalists. So the military establishment or the intelligence, which is the strongest institution in Pakistan, has set some topics as, you don't want to touch them. We are going to tell you how you're going to report it, because they have connected it to the national security of the country, perceived national security. Now, when I say perceived, which means it has been created, the public is made to believe that it is a threat to national security. Now, what then happens is, then in framing studies in the media, and I just want to remind people who are listening to us who may not be aware of the word framing, it's like a picture frame. It is how and in what light you present that information. Now, in some cases, that frame building is done by the government, by political elites, by military establishment, by intelligence agencies in Pakistan, and just like in many, many other countries. And so some of these topics are where journalists are not allowed to use their own journalistic judgment or their journalistic responsibility or their journalistic access to report. Afghan refugees are one of the most important topics where it's a no-go area. just like the Baloch, the rights of the Baloch people in Pakistan or how relationships with India are portrayed in the media. And so and so that and so then it becomes very important, because now it becomes the case of a threat to a journalist's safety, a threat to their job. And so that's how it is politicized. And the reason why Afghan refugees are politicized is because they are one of the ways for the military establishment to use as a card against Afghanistan. Because this is where you play, you allow, you keep a bargaining leverage. So they're kept as a bargaining leverage. I'm not very familiar with the game of cards, but of whatever understanding I have is that you always keep the best towards the end, and then at least this is what we see in the movies. And I think this is how Afghan refugees are used in this, as the card. So we play this card. And we have seen that happening in the recent wave of Afghan refugees after the takeover by the de facto Taliban government as well, of how Afghan refugees were used, exploited to push the authorities in Afghanistan. And of course, because of the relationships that the Pakistani government have had with the democratic governments in Afghanistan, more so that of President Ashraf Ghani, they were politicized to put pressure on the Afghan government at the time. To understand that, we have to go back to the stages of framing. So when framing happens, which is how a certain issue is framed, is put in forward for the public, is put in a certain light. So there's 3 stages. The first stage is frame building, which is done by the political actors. Journalists don't have a lot of say in this process. Political elites will choose how a certain policy or how a certain campaign or how a certain image needs to be put forward out there. And then they will pick and choose journalists who are going to do that work for them. And then comes the journalist's role. That's the second stage, which is framing. Now, okay, I've received an agenda, and now I have to put through this agenda in a certain way by incorporating these images and then dehumanization, for instance, in the coverage. And then the third stage is framing effects, of how people are affected by that framing. So framing does not happen overnight. It does not also affect people overnight. It happens over years and years, just like propaganda. We are all affected in one way or the other by, say, the American propaganda through Hollywood, right? And it does not. So how we look at Arab people, or how we look at Chinese people, or how we look at Asians, or how we look at a certain group of people or a certain characteristic, is very much related to what kind of messages we have been receiving over the last, say, 20, 30, 40 years. So this happens over time. It's a long process. And so constantly, when something is framed in a way, and I've also been talking about this in my other interviews at other platforms, is that when something is presented to you as a reality again and again and again, it's a human psyche. And again, I'm not a psychologist, but looking by doing audience studies of how audience perceives it, generation after generation starts believing in that truth. And so then that truth becomes a reality. You construct that truth. You make that truth. You give birth to that truth. And then you can, of course, keep retouching the aspects of that truth according to how you want your political game to be. And the media's role is so significant. It's so powerful, because it is about changing people's mind, changing people's perceptions, controlling an agenda, and then making sure that people stick to that agenda. So yeah, and so in Pakistani media, framing, as I said, of certain issues, such as Afghan refugees, or the issue of Baloch people in Balochistan, or India. These are very important. So they are constantly framed in a certain way. The policies of so it's very rampant. It's very prominent. It's very predominant. My study finds that I will talk about that later, of what aspect is more prominent in the media. But I think, and what my research suggests is that about 60 to 80% of framing is done through frames that are provided by the political elite. You see, in countries where you don't have a lot of philanthropic funding for the media, you don't have a lot of private funding for the media, and especially now in the digital age, where people expect to access the media for free, they get really upset if they have to pay for something. Unlike the time when I was growing up, when we used to pay for newspapers, and it was a very common understanding that if you pay, you get the news. If you don't pay, you don't get the news. And I'm talking about published, and I'm talking about the press, of course, not the free to air. Even our television channels, you pay for the cable and then you have access to this. So the only free to air channel was the public broadcaster, which was the Pakistan Television, which is PTV. So in this particular case, over 60% of the money or the ad revenue that the media in Pakistan make is from advertisements from the government. And the rest, 30 to 40%, and it may have changed a bit over the last few years, comes from private advertisements. And we know that just like any other businesses, journalism or news industry also needs money, because they need to survive, they need to pay their journalists, and it's really expensive to report, and especially with these new technologies. So then what happens is that these 4 publications, so I've looked at the Express Tribune, I've looked at Dawn, I've looked at the Herald and the Newsline. They have had their history of problems with the government, and specifically with the military establishment, the intelligence agencies as well. Some of these I have experienced directly during my time there as a journalist, of how particular and how meticulous they were about what can go and what cannot go in the news. And so, in fact, yes, they have suffered. There have been sanctions on them. There have been journalists have been removed from positions where they cannot report anymore. They have been put on exit control lists because they were talking about peace, either with India or other issues, by confronting the status quo or by making them accountable. For instance, one of these publications that I studied, the Herald magazine, which is used to be published by the Dawn group, but was separate from the newspaper, closed because of lack of funding. Newsline closed because of lack of funding. And it is so sad that most of peace-oriented journalism that I found was in Herald, and the Herald does not exist anymore because they did not have. So it's not just economic pressure, it is also the pressure to not put certain things in narrative. And economically, the media are struggling everywhere, in the West as well. The media are struggling. They want money, and there's not enough money. The media industry in all is very politicized because of all these pressures. But more so in areas like, mainly the global South, the majority world, but especially in the context of my research, Pakistan, journalists are not only facing those who want to speak and who want to do responsible, accurate, ethical, free journalism. They're not only silenced because from these sanctions, they're also silenced because there's a threat to their lives. We have had attacks on journalists one after another. We've had journalists being shot. We've had journalists being shot even after they went into exile. And it continues. So Yeah, and it's only getting worse. And I think economic sanctions are, or taking your advertisements away, is one of the way where you can really grapple, your prey by the neck, until it becomes very difficult to breathe. Yeah. As you said, that I haven't explored it a lot because it is beyond the remit of my study and also beyond the remit of my expertise. But the little bit that I have ventured into, first of all, these religious organizations, they do not have a very direct control over the media because, as I said, they don't have that kind of power. They do have influence, but that is more or less limited to other aspects, such as women, the reporting of women or women's rights, or when you talk about now the LGBTQ rights, so those aspects. But what happens is that they have control in certain parts of the country. Where they have influence is in the northwestern parts of the country, but not enough where they can completely shift what the media are reporting. There have been attacks on some journalists from these extremists, not necessarily religious groups, but some extremist groups, including the TTP. But those have mostly been because they are not happy that the mainstream news does not give them enough coverage. They also need to be. But that was in my discussion generally about the state of media and how many stakeholders there are. I mean, in Pakistan, there are three major stakeholders that are included in the political ecosystem. And their impact is there, albeit on different levels and different extents. So that's the military or the intelligence services. Then you've got your mainstream politicians, and then you've got your religious parties as well. Some of them with very extremist ideologies, but not all of them. But yeah, they do definitely, because you see, religion is a very touchy subject, and specifically in countries such as Pakistan, religion is used and exploited to make people believe in something and do something. But in specifically in the context of Afghan refugees, because they come from another Muslim majority country, they don't have a very significant role to play in specifically the way Afghan refugees are framed in the media. First of all, I'll go to your terminology thing. So I am a researcher of how human suffering is mediated, either on social media or mainstream media. What is human suffering? Suffering is anything that makes you suffer. A state that you can be oppressed in that state, and when you're oppressed, you suffer. Um, I I I don't see any equivalence to degradation in the interchangeable in the interchange of the use of the word refugee or suffering or sufferer or even oppressed, is because when I talk about Afghan refugees, I do not talk about the privileged class. There are Afghan refugees, not necessarily living in Pakistan with the status of a refugee, because there are many Afghans who have been part of the politics, or the right wing politics in Afghanistan, who've been invited to settle. For example, if a member of the Taliban gets up and says, I am a refugee, you do not categorize them as someone who is suffering at the hands of the system. So what in the context of my research, I am specifically looking at Afghan refugees who are vulnerable because they don't have the power to change, or they are suffering because they don't know, they're uncertain. They don't know if I am going to spend my night on Pakistani land tonight, or will I have to go and live close to the Durand line and will have to sleep with my children under the open sky, something that we have witnessed since the Pakistani government had started forcibly repatriating hundreds and thousands of refugees after the 2021 fall of Kabul. So in that state, what happens is that these refugees are left at the mercy of the state. The state allows them to live, good. If the state does not allow them to stay there, they need to go back. So they are vulnerable because they don't have that agency, they don't have land, they don't have, their children cannot go to the school, to the same school as children of other people go. I'll give you one personal experience that I had. In one of the, so I had a couple of Afghan friends who were journalists who were visiting Pakistan at a time when I was also working there as a journalist. And one of them was suddenly unwell. And so I took her to a hospital in Islamabad, and they refused to treat her, saying she is an Afghan refugee and she's not documented. Now, she was visiting on a legitimate tourist visa. And so that experience really shook me, because there was one person who was in significant pain to an extent that she could have died. We did not know what's happening with her. But on the other hand, and I'm not even talking about senior doctors, I'm talking about these receptionists or nurses on the reception who refused to take this person to the emergency, only because this person is an Afghan refugee. Again, at this state, at that situation, that human lost their value as a human, because it was more important which document that they had or did not. And that's one of the reasons I started looking at how Afghan refugees, why is it that they are treated like this, specifically in these emergency situations. So at that position, she was vulnerable. She was at the hand of the mercy of the authorities. We did eventually had to make a few calls here and there for them to have a look at her, just, on guarantees and all. So I am not aware of any research where or any narrative that looks at the word suffering as something that is degrading or vulnerable. In fact, what I argue is for peace journalism to be used to give these people a voice. So, to make their voice more audible so that they can be heard. Yeah. So I do talk about in my book how refugees were welcome and that the door was open, because in the time of Zia ul Haq, they were looked at as the friends of Pakistan. So let them come. We are going to, because that was in the political interest of the country at that time. So it's fine. Let the civil war be there. We are going to take as many refugees. This is also your land, which technically is also a shared land. But suddenly, after this war on terror, the narrative changed, and now the same refugees who'd been living in Pakistan, in this part of Pakistan, were now somehow illegal. So I also talk about the fact that there was a certain date after which the Pakistani government refused to give proof of registration cards to Afghan refugees. The POR, the proof of registration card, as those who've lived a life of a refugee would know, that it's a proof of your documentation. So one of the reasons why, and again, I don't want to go into politics right now because we're talking about my book here, but one of the reasons that a lot of refugees are intentionally kept undocumented is because then a lot of UNHCR money is coming to Pakistan. And so they cannot then they will have to be responsible for the inventory of every dollar that is taken on the name of an Afghan refugee. So I also again see this as putting them in a vulnerable position where you're not documenting them. Yes, of course, there will always be some people who are going to exploit the system, such as there are many Taliban members who live in Pakistan and they don't want to be documented, but there are also many who have Pakistani cards, CNICs, the computerized national ID cards. And so what my point here it is that we are only told that there is a certain number of Afghan refugees. It's a big number, but we are looking after them. But actually the problem is way bigger. And when I say problem, I mean the problem that is faced by the Afghan refugees. because not everyone in these Afghan refugees is a Taliban leader, right? Not everyone is a Gulbuddin Hikmatyar. Not everyone. These are ordinary people like you and I who've been forced to leave their country and been forced to seek refuge in a neighboring country, because for any refugee, the first place of safety is always across the border. And so when you don't, and there are historical ties, you would have seen that in the start of my book, I do first inform the reader that this is a shared land and that they are on their own land. The Afghans in the western part of Pakistan are indeed on their own land. And that's why later in the book, I talk about how an insider becomes an outsider, is made an outsider to the land.